Well, hi again everybody. Welcome to my latest server build video. Sorry for the long delay in getting this one out. It's been probably about 6 months since I did the first video on installing Samba, the actual Active Directory component that will allow my server to be an authentication server in my home network, home/office network that is. But I ran into a problem. A new version of XigmaNAS at the time caused some issues with Samba, and now they fixed that. And I also decided to clean things up a little bit along the way because I was overcomplicating it. So some of what I showed in the first video, I'm going to be redoing in a different way in this video, and I'll show that to you in a couple of minutes. But I do want to make sure that I let you know that this is not going to be the only video on the Samba install. I'm going to actually have to break this into two parts. First, the actual configuration of Samba itself on the XigmaNAS server, or at least the image of the XigmaNAS server, since I'll be using VirtualBox to make this video. However, also in a follow-up video to this one, I'm going to show how to use the RSAT toolkit that's provided by Windows. It comes with Windows 10, you just have to configure it, and it allows you to do a remote admin of an Active Directory server. And I'll show you that, not in this video, but the very next one. And then finally, there will be a video even after that, which will show the final mods that I'm doing on the case for my new server. So hopefully you get something out of this video, and if you do me a favor and subscribe to my channel, or at least consider doing so. It really doesn't cost anything, and it will help a lot in terms of allowing me to grow with this channel. Okay, let's get started. You may remember this flowchart from the last video. This is the one that I used to initially install XigmaNAS, and then also set up the database as a NAS, and then finally to try to install Samba, which is the Active Directory, to make my server a security server. However, I ran into a problem with that when I tried to do it, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm changing things around a little bit. First, to simplify it, it actually makes it much simpler if I do not put the root file system as ZFS. I'm going to now resort to the default operating system for FreeBSD, which is UFS. And what that will mean is I no longer have to do these 3 steps. And they were pretty complicated anyway and did overcomplicate things in my opinion. So even though there's a few benefits to having ZFS in the root file system, I have determined that those benefits don't apply to my configuration. So there's no point in adding the risk to it and also to overly complicate this video. So we're going to skip that and do a much simpler install, which I'll show you in this video. All of the middle steps here will stay pretty much the same as I did last time. I am not going to re-show them except for this final one on enabling the Samba Active Directory services. Since that did not work the last time I tried it, I am going to now do it properly and have it work in this video. But all these other boxes leading up to that, I'm not going to do. I'm going to jump right to a VirtualBox image that already has that all installed and configured. Actually, it'll look very similar to the configuration that I did in the one video that was to show how to use XigmaNAS just as a file server, where I put all of the Star Trek command characters in it. So that's what I've done on this one as well. And I need real characters in there to show you, once I got Samba installed, how that works. This section though, using Windows Client with RSAT and all of these particular steps, they're not going to be in this video. I'm going to put those in a second video to this. So that'll be the next video that I release that'll cover those steps. And then there'll be even a video after that, as I mentioned earlier, and that will be the final case mods that I'm going to do for my server right before I put it into service. So with that, let's move on to the install of the operating system using UFS. Okay, before I get started, I wanted to show you the disk structure that we'll be seeing, just in case some questions come to mind as you watch this video. Now, what I'm going to show you here are the actual disk structures of my real server that will eventually go into production, probably after 2 more videos because of the way I've laid things out. As you may recall, it has a 240 gig SSD in it. Now, after we install the UFS operating system on it, it will have 4 partitions created. The first partition is the one that's used for boot code, the one that would boot the drive up, a rather small partition. and then XigmaNAS operating system itself, and then the third one is the swap space, which we define, and you'll see that during the installation, and then finally the remainder of the disk will be general data area that is usable, and I'll show you, if not in this video, in the next video, how we can actually set that up and mount it so that it can be mounted across the network and used by a Windows client. Of course, in addition to this disk, we also have 4 hard drives in my server. They are each 6 terabyte, and they are going to be partitioned with ZFS, which is a software partitioning for the NAS data under XigmaNAS, and the XigmaNAS operating system itself is the one that handles that. So it doesn't matter if this is different from the root file system. Now I'm going to be using VirtualBox to show you this demonstration today that'll eventually mimic into my real server. But the sizes of the hard disk images that I'll be using in showing you this are going to be much smaller than these sizes. So I just wanted to point that out before we started, just in case it leading to any confusion. Okay, so let's get started with installing UFS operating system onto the root file system. Okay, here's the VirtualBox with the images set up that I'll be playing with today. And what I have at the very bottom here is a raw image. I actually have this a duplicate of a previous one. It only has XigmaNAS set up to be installed. It does not have XigmaNAS installed yet, but I have set up, as you can see here by the storage, it has not just only a hard disk setup of 16 gigabytes for the root file system, but it also has the second drive set up as an optical drive, which is the way you fool VirtualBox, as you may recall, into thinking that it's actually booting from a regular DVD or CD drive. And then I've set up 3 hard drive images. Now, even though my real server will have 4, for purposes of this demonstration, I'll only use 3. So I have 3 16 gigabyte hard disks attached to it to different SATA ports, and that'll be recognizable as we install the UFS file system. So let's go ahead and we'll double click on this and get it started. This is as if we were booting right from a USB stick. This is what we're mimicking here. I like to make the view scale so I can scale it here. So it thinks it's booting from a USB stick, really, or a CD. This is the base install of XigmaNAS, as you may recall. Okay, so now that we're here, the base install, we want to go straight into doing option number 9, install. Now, in my last video, I went down to option 6, which was ZFS. On this one, we're not going to do that. We're going to install a full OS on the hard disk or SSD with swap space, but using the default operating system, which is going to be UFS. Okay, so we want to install first choice here. And this is what I showed you before on the slide. This is going to show the 4 partitions that it will create. Now I have to define the size of some of these. Other ones, they'll go for default. Just so you understand how this matches up to what I mentioned earlier. Okay, it thinks it's loading a CD. That's fine. Now it sees 4 hard drives attached to this one. They happen to be exactly the same size. Maybe I should have made the first one a little bit smaller, but that's okay. I know that it is a different one. I'm going to go ahead and install on that first one, ADA0. That's the ID that is used in FreeBSD to identify that particular hard disk. The other 3, 1, 2, and 3, ADA, they will become the ZFS partition space. So let's go ahead and install this. Now it's asking how big of an OS partition do I want. It defaults to 3072. I'm going to do 4096 megabytes. Just give it a little bit of extra room. Okay? And then it wants a swap space. It defaults to only 1024 megabytes, which is basically 1 gigabyte. I'm going to up that a little bit more. I'm going to double that, 2048. Just give it a little extra room to breathe here. Now to enter the size of the data partition, now we have a lot of the disk that's going to be left here. The 240 gig hard drive in the real world, and over here it's like 17 gig. So that's still a lot of space even for this one. I'm going to say all, so I get all the remaining ones. It's now installing. Okay, it's completed the installation. I want you to take note of something here. If you look at this thing here, it says to use the data partition, there's some notes here. Add the disk ADA0 onto the disk management page, mount it, create a mount point for it, and use the following partition information to mount it. We are going to be doing that, probably not in this video, it depends on timing, but definitely in the next video that I do on this, once we have the system actually with mountable space. But it tells you not to format it because it's already just formatted it. So there's no reason to format it a second time. So we'll move on. And that's it. At this point, we are fully installed and it is waiting for us to move on. I'm going to exit the installer here, and we're back to this. So now what I have to do is I need to reboot it, but I'm going to do a shutdown first. And the reason I'm going to do that, I don't want there to be any misunderstandings of where it's going to boot from. So I want to shut it down first. This is something I've learned as I played with VirtualBox, that it's the safest thing to do when installing a new image. So I'm going to do a shutdown first. I really do want to do that. It's going to shut the image down. We'll be back in VirtualBox once the thing is completely shut down. So what I want to do here, now that I'm back in VirtualBox, is I want to remove the USB stick. I'm going to do the equivalent of that, or this DVD. And I do that by coming into here, and you see where it's doing live CD under the IDE controller, because that's how it defaulted with FreeBSD. It put the main ADA0, the first hard disk image, on the master port of the IDE controller, and it put the CD drive or DVD drive on the slave port. I'm going to just get rid of that. So you come over here, one of these buttons removes it. Am I sure I want to remove that? Now we no longer have a CD or DVD. So now there's no confusion when I boot it where it's going to boot from. It only has one thing to boot from, which is the main hard drive, as you see here. Let me continue with just the next basic install too, just to show you I can get it up. And then I'll jump over a bunch of steps and get you to the point that we need to talk about in terms of getting ready for the Samba install. But let me just show you this first. Let me go ahead and run it again. Now we're rebooting that image, because I have to configure the network on it. So I might as well just do that just to show you that that is a step you have to make sure you always do. It should boot up a little bit differently now, we'll see. It doesn't have to unzip the image itself from the CD or DVD, so it should come up a little bit quicker, and we did. But look, it's got the wrong IP address on it. That's not the IP address of my little test network here. I need to change that. So I need to log in. The default login is root. The instructions for XigmaNAS said that, as I pointed out in a previous image. The password is just XigmaNAS, XigmaNAS. Okay, I said that because they published that on the website. Now we want to do a configure interface, number one, and it sees one of the interfaces up and connected. So remember, we are doing a bridge adapter. So it's using the same subnet that I have in my test environment here, that my main PC here is on. So I'm going to say OK to this. That's it. So I'm going to say I want to proceed. It's now actually configuring the hard drive image for that. So now it knows about the interface. That's the one we want to use. There was only one to use. This locks it in. Now we want to configure it. Do you want to use DHCP? No, you cannot use DHCP for Samba. If you did that, it just would not work at all, believe me. We want to change this IP address, the same one I showed before. We want a class C, so we're going to have a subnet with 24 bits excluded, which means we have 8 bits included. That's what this means here, which means that we can have up to 254 actual IP usable addresses in that space. The default IP gateway, which happens to be in that same subnetwork. The DNS. I'm going to use a published DNS, Google, I believe, all 8. I do not want to configure IPv6. It's now initializing, saving that in the actual image. It assigned it the right address, and now we're up and running. I'm going to open up a Windows image, and I'll show you how I can get to that server, because I'm going to use Windows itself to actually do the configuration of this. I'm not going to do it from my main CPU. So this is a Windows image I've already had set up and working. I'm going to log into this. So now if I come in here, run Windows Explorer, go to that address, 172.16.1.210, what do we get? There I am. I'm actually connected up. It's hard. It may not be obvious, but if I wasn't connected, we'd have a conflict of addresses. This is the one that's on the network as 210. So now I've connected to that one at 210. You see it up here in the URL, and I can log in. In this case, when you use the WebGUI for XigmaNAS, as we've shown before, you don't use root, you use admin, but it's the same password. And now we're up and running. This is the actual XigmaNAS server that has answered to me that we just created. So let me now move on past this to a version of the server that I've already configured with all of the users on it and everything else, because right now this has no users. If I go to Access and I look at Users and Group and I turn off the system, there's nothing here. I went ahead after this and made a version of the server that actually has all of those accounts already set up. It actually already has the drives set up and all formatted with all those other steps I showed you in the flow chart at the beginning of this video. So let's move on to that now. Okay, what I have up now is the server with all of the accounts installed and all of the various data sets that are needed, including the data sets, the special one in particular that's required by Samba in order for it to function properly. And I'll show you how all those were set up. So first of all, if you look on the front page here, you see that it's up and running. This particular one has 2 cores, whereas the one I was running a few moments ago had only 1. So I upped the core count inside of VirtualBox for this particular image, just to show that it can work. Let's look at the general settings. So in the general settings, what we have to look for is that we have all the prerequisites set. First of all, make sure you set your time zone. So what I have right here, I have it set for America's New York. Then we have to set up, this is important, use the specified NTP server. So you can actually turn this off, but we want it on. So I click on it. By default, this is how it looks. You turn that on, it defaults to pool.ntp.org, which is fine. And I leave the time alone in terms of how many seconds to wait. That's like 5 minutes, I think, 300 seconds. And this is important. Pick a host name. Has to be unique on your network. Don't pick one that duplicates with anything else. For example, when you install Windows, it automatically assigns certain host names to those. Be aware of that. And then I have purchased my own domain. It cost about $12 as I recall. It's good for a year, and I'll probably renew it because eventually I'm going to have my own web page here. And this is the domain pefordoers.com. So that way there's no conflicts out on the internet. I own that PE for Doers domain, and that's the way I'm going to set up everything in my network going forward. Then I have to pick I didn't have to change this, by the way. It defaulted to what I put during the installation, 8.8.8.8, which is the one for, I believe, Google, which is their general public domain server. So these are the important setups on the basic configuration. Now let's take a look at the virtual devices. So if we come in here and we go to this ZFS and we pick virtual devices, you'll see that I set up a virtual device here. I'll open it up just so you can get a look at it. Nothing fancy there. It's using RAID Z1 in my case because I have 4 drives and I wanted to be able to survive losing one of those 4. Basically, I'll wind up with about 75% of the total space available to me. And you see 4 drives here. One slight difference from the image I was using a few moments ago. This one has 4 drives that I'm using for data, and they are approximately 20 gigabytes. So they were combined together into this one or virtual device. So that's an important thing to understand. We've already got it installed, and if you go into actual disk management, it shows the 5 drives that this particular system has, in this case a virtual image. The first one, ADA0, we've already talked about. That holds my base operating system, swap space, and some general data area that we can share. And then the 4 devices that make up the area that will become the ZFS pool for creating shares onto the network. Good for that. What else? Let's take a look at the pools. Pools are pretty straightforward here. We got one pool. I called it Z pool. It has 85.35 gigabytes in it. Now, that doesn't account for the fact that about 25% of that, because it is Z1, will be used for purposes of replication in case one drive is lost. So what you see here is the full 100%. In reality, I only have about 75% of that available for real storage. And there's no particular setup that's unique here. It was pretty straightforward. There was no special options on this. Then we look at the regular disk. That's a Z pool. Okay. Then let's take a look at what becomes important. And what becomes important is the data set. The data sets are critical here. If you look at the data sets, what do I have? Keep in mind, I did mention I was going to add all of the users on this, including all of those Star Trek characters that I did in one of my earlier videos where we showed how to set up XigmaNAS just as a file server, a NAS. Well, if we look at the data sets now, there's a whole bunch here. I also turned on compression. In further analysis of it, you should always have LZ4 compression turned on by default. It will save you a little bit of space on your disk storage, and you don't really lose any cycles with it decompressing, so you might as well turn that on. You see the pools that I normally create, David admin. We see Kirk, McCoy, Spock. I only put those 3 characters on this version of it. I didn't put Sulu, but there was no point for purposes of the demonstration here. But look at these 2 here. Now, obviously the pool itself, the one that I call pool, which is the main data pool, the large one that has the 83 gigabytes on it. But look at this notation, pool/AD. It's a special case, and that's needed for Samba. So let's look at pool first. And I want to point out a few things about this that are important. The top part is about the same, but I have the LZ4 compression turned on. Of course, always leave dedupe off. That's in for very special cases, which almost nobody's ever going to use. The sync is standard. Access time, I don't have any limitations on it. But what did I do here? I changed it. I believe this was one of the ones above it. I'm not sure if it was no allow or restricted, but I changed it to pass-through. That's required in order for Samba to work properly. So please set that way, one of the lessons learned. And the same thing for the ACL mode. It was set to one of the ones above it, like I think it was group mask. It has to be passed through. So these are the two options that I changed. The other options we didn't really touch. For this particular pool, I didn't put any reservations on it, so it's going to use all available space. And I left the ownership and the permissions alone. Although probably I could have gone ahead and turned off write for the world, but I decided since the only one who ever logs on to this server are administrative personnel, it's really not going to matter. This is not accessible to the network. It's only for local users to the FreeBSD that underlies XigmaNAS. Okay, let me cancel out of this one and look at the next one. Well, this one's important. This is the special pool that's needed for Samba. And it looks almost exactly the same. It also is using the LZ4 compression. It also has these options set for pass-through. It has basically everything the same as we saw with pool, but the name is different. The name that was specified was pool/AD, which made it as a sub-pool to the regular pool. And we used the term AD for Active Directory, just so it's clear when you're looking back at this what that particular area is used. Very little space is going to be used. I think in my last video when I showed how to create this, I specified a maximum size to it. Well, there was no need to do that according to this latest version of XigmaNAS. So now that's no longer the case. So that's one of the big changes as well. And then all of the other pools that we have are pretty much straightforward. Let me take a look at one of them. Let's take a look at Kirk, for example. What's different here? Well, not a lot up front here. It's still the same compression, it's still the pass-throughs, but I did put a reservation. 5 gig minimum, 7 gig maximum. That's its maximum quota. And I did block out the world on that one because these properties are going to be passed through when there's shares set up for it onto a client somewhere, a Windows client. So I wanted to make sure that those were set properly. I did all this work on the image before actually bringing it up and restarting the video because a lot of this is just, labor and time. There was no point in me going through it all. I just showed you what I changed, and the rest of it pretty much follows suit with it. The normal way you deal with the menus in XigmaNAS, at least through the WebGUI. But this is different now. Now we're going to go over to a couple of things I want to check first. First, I want to show you that I did not turn on the SMB service. That's the normal NAS networking service that we used before, and I showed you how it worked on a previous version of XigmaNAS being used as a file server. If you look at that, I have the service not active, no there. Do double check to make sure because I think in one image this thing was not set right. Make sure the NetBIOS name is the capitalized version because you can still edit this. You can come down here and edit it. I'm not sure if it was this image or another one. I had to change this. Still had the default XigmaNAS in there. So I had to change this. Always make NetBIOS name all capital letters though. So keep that one in mind. You don't have to worry about the workbook. That's going to be overridden by the domain later on. You can put whatever description you want. I think I actually changed this to XigmaNAS server, but I didn't enable it. That was the important thing here. This is not enabled. And I pretty much think that everything else is the same. Yeah, I didn't really touch anything else in here. So that's the SMB service, the regular NAS service that's used. Now let's go to Samba. Now, before I touch this, before I enable it, I want to show you something else. If we go to Tools, if we go to Status, and we pick Status Processes, I want you to notice something here. You will not see any services running that have to do with either SMB or Samba. You see the default FreeBSD services running, but I'm not going to go into any of those other services as standard FreeBSD, but keep this in mind when we come back to it. And that, I think, takes care of it. So if we now go to Samba AD, the first thing we have to do, and it's sort of in reverse order, I guess because you only do this once, you really got to go to Initialize first. You don't start off with settings. That comes after you've initialized it. So in the initialize, what do we need? A lot of this is carried forward, an awful lot of it. So if you look at this, you'll see that the PE4doers.com carried forward, and the NetBIOS version of it, all the capital letters of just the part to the left of the .com. Of course, my DNS forwarder carried forward to it, the actual test PDC. So we have the host name and the capitalized version, which is called the NetBIOS name. Again, because this is following with the Windows terminology. The only thing that I really have to fill are these boxes here. Now, password. You don't have to put a password in here. it actually says right here, if you leave it blank, then when you initialize, it will generate one. A generated one would look like this. This is the output of the initialization is what I'm looking at right now. Here's a password that was generated by the initialization. K0F5 capital G lowercase b lowercase y dot space open paren capitals etc etc. That is some password. That's not very user friendly, as they say. If you let it generate one and then you don't like that password, you'll have to go and log into the console. You would have to use this tool, Samba-tool space user space set password space administrator. So you would use this tool to actually change the password to something that makes more sense to you. Alternatively, you don't have to have it generated. What you can do is pick your own. So if I pick the password that I want to use, I'm not going to show it online here obviously, but it is 16 characters, but it's 16 characters that I will remember. And you have to be careful about this. If you get it wrong, it will give you a warning, but it might cause an error that you don't want to deal with. So I will type it in. I have to type it in a second time. It's a very strong password, believe me. Then the next thing we have to do is set our path. Now this, all I have to do is click on these three little dots here, and it will show me here what's available. So right now I have zpool, and under zpool, what do I have? All the accounts for the users and pool by itself. If I click on pool now, I see another directory below it. And as I click on each of these, it's adding itself up over here on the line. That'll be the directory inside of FreeBSD for it to find the area that it can save its configuration for. When I say it, I refer to the Samba services. So I'll say okay to that, and that becomes the path that I want. In addition, I have to turn on these two options. By default, they're not on. Now the append user-defined shares, that allows me to create those data sets and use them as shares through the administration tool of Active Directory later on. If I don't do that, I will have to add them through the Active Directory tool. They will not carry over. And with that, I believe that's everything I need. All I have to do is now push the button initialize. And now it's initializing Samba. The very last time I did this on film, it did not go well. But this time, if you see this stuff at the bottom here, where it's carried over your host name, your domain name, and it's given you a site ID, SID, this long number here with dashes and numbers and letters in it, it does not show a password because it doesn't have to. It accepted my password. The Samba service checks the strength of that password that you put in that box. It better meet their minimum standard. The second step is to go to settings now, and this is where you would actually turn it on. So in the settings, there's a few things you have to do here too. And in particular, there is a particular set of text you have to type in here, some options, parameters to it. So let me open up the file that has that, so I can just copy and paste it. So this file I had saved on my server, which has the 3 different options you have to turn on. So I'll just copy and paste that. Everything else, I believe, carried over properly from the initialize. And then once you've done that, all we have to do is enable, make sure you click this little checkbox here, and then hit save and restart. It says the changes have been applied successfully. Now we come in and now we check the processes, and look at this. We now have a bunch of processes running that say Samba on them. So each of the data sets that we created is getting its own Samba subprocess running. This guy is now completely installed, and it is a full Active Directory server ready to be connected to. So in the next video, that's exactly what we're going to do. Okay, well that seemed to work out very well. So now we've actually completed install of all of the software on the XigmaNAS itself. And in the next video, I'll be showing you how to use the Microsoft RSAT Toolkit, RSAT, in terms of creating and managing accounts and shares using a Windows type server environment, as you will see in the next video. So hopefully you got something out of this video, or you just found it enjoyable in some way. And if you did, please do me a favor and consider subscribing to my channel. It really doesn't cost anything. Just click on the little head here that'll pop up in a moment, follow along, and subscribe. It would be very helpful in helping this channel grow. Anyway, until the next time, take care, and I'll see you soon.